and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today for a really important program we're calling America's Report Card, how the Biden administration is doing a little over a year into its term. A war in Europe, the ongoing impact of COVID, supply chain disruptions, skyrocketing inflation, worker shortages, and political battles continue to pose challenges for the White House. There is some good news, too, and we'll get to that as well. But ahead of the State of the Union address on March 1st, we're taking stock of the administration's response to domestic and foreign policy priorities in a midterm year. We've got a strong lineup of speakers and we're going to be hearing from this afternoon. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillSOTU. That's The Hill SOTU. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, if it goes wonky on you, don't throw the computer out the window. Just refresh the page. They tell me that'll fix the problem, and I hope it does. My first guest has had a front row seat during the Biden presidential campaign and at the White House this past year. His actual job is to have direct discussions with Americans and act as the liaison between the Biden-Harris administration and the public. Cedric Richmond is the director of White House Office of Public Engagement, and he's been a senior advisor to President Biden. Of course, we all know him as a long-term member of Congress from Louisiana, which, as I understand it, Louisiana's got a pretty good chunk of folks in the White House. So, Cedric Richmond, great to be with you. Look, we're doing this on purpose. I try to take this moment when we're around the time of the State of the Union address to sort of look deeply at what the nation's challenges are, what progress has been made. I just love to hear, as you look forward, both, we've got big issues. Your Supreme Court nominee just announced, and we've got crazy stuff happening in Ukraine with Russia's invasion. But tell us what your priorities are for the State of the Union address as the president speaks to us next week.
I think what the president will do, first of all, thanks for having me. And two, I think what the president will do is lay out his vision for the next year, but also talk about the challenges that we met during the first year. And look, every president will face the same thing. They will make a number of promises and have an agenda from the campaign trail, which they will try to keep those promises. And then they'll meet the challenges as they come. And look, with this administration, we've had a number of challenges that we had to meet, starting on day one with COVID, moving on to Colonial Pipeline, to Afghanistan, to all of those things. And we are meeting challenges, even if you look at where we are now in the president's incredible leadership with the Russian Ukraine. So our goal is to continue to do those things, but also look at those things that are affecting families. And right now we know rising costs is something that many families are facing, and we are specifically looking and trying to address that every day.
When I look at inflation, and for anyone who basically tries to disaggregate why inflation is driving prices up now, some of it is the semiconductor shortage. Some of it is that after COVID, there's huge demand for everything. And sometimes a president is looked at as someone saying, what's the quick fix? When actually they don't have many of the tools to fix that. How do you address that kind of problem where a White House is not, particularly in the United States, we're not a command economy, we're a market economy?
Well, I think part of what you said is a good point, and it's the relationship between supply and demand. And if you go back, 12 years ago, when we came out the Great Recession, we had cars everywhere on car lots, but no one could afford to buy them. Now we're in a situation where people actually have the funds and the desire to buy cars, but we don't have enough cars available because of the chip shortage, which is why we are pushing through Congress the Competes Act and the USICA bill, which would create more chips. If you look at what Intel has done in terms of announcing multiple $20 billion investments in the United States to build semiconductors and chips, that's in a direct response to what we're doing to increase the supply. What we don't want to do is decrease people's ability to afford goods and services. We need to make sure that we're increasing the other side, which is goods and services. So you see what we're doing at the ports, where they're working 24 hours, and now there are more goods going through the ports of America than ever before. So we are pushing to ease the supply chain issues, the bottlenecks, at the same time create more products. And I think that that is the way to do it. And if you look at the forecast still predict inflation to ease substantially by the end of 2022. But I think there's other parts of the economy we have to look at, which is we've created more jobs in the first year than any other president has done in 1 year in the history of the United States. Our economic growth is faster than it's been in the last 40 years. It's faster than China. It's faster than everyone. So those things are all the good side, but the growing pains of that is that we have a real inflation problem. We're looking at it. And we're also looking at the corporations that have so much market power that they can simply just raise profits and to some extent pandemic profiteering and just raising goods for more profits.
I've been watching, Cedric, your comments in the press the last few weeks about the search for the president's next nominee to the Supreme Court. And I saw you saying, we're getting close, we're getting there, we're going through them. Now we're there, and you likely have a nominee. And I'd just be interested in what, tell us about her. Tell us why the president has confidence in her.
Well, thanks for the question. The president today announced that he is picking Ketanji Brown Jackson to be his nominee for the Supreme Court. She is very qualified. She, in fact, has been confirmed by the Senate 3 times on a bipartisan vote each time. Once for the United States Sentencing Commission, which I think was a unanimous vote. Once for the D.C. District Court, and once for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, all of which she received Republican votes. But she's also a brilliant legal scholar. She clerked for Justice Breyer. She studied under him, and she's that smart, pragmatic judge who we believe will represent America well. She'll be someone who all of America can look up to, and it's filling a void that's been missing from the court for a long time. I mean, her credentials are impeccable. So we're excited to get the confirmation process going and to see her confirmed as the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court.
So I know she is going to be the president's nominee, but there was an interesting feature of this discussion where Senator Lindsey Graham and even Congressman Jim Clyburn jumped in supporting another black female candidate very robustly, very strongly. That's not your nominee. Are you going to have to do some bridge building there? Or bridge fixing, I should say.
Let's be clear. I cannot speak for Senator Graham, but I do think that I know Jim Clyburn, who's one of my best friends and mentors, pretty well. What the congressman was stressing is that we have a person with real life experiences and who, because he believes, and his book is called Blessed Experiences, because he thinks people are shaped by their life experience, and he's so right. So part of what Ketanji Brown's life experience, her parents were HBCU graduates. She went to public schools. Her parents taught public schools. Her dad went to night school to get his law degree and then became a lawyer and actually represented the school board. So she has those real life experiences and those challenges. When she went to her guidance counselor and said that she wanted to go to Harvard, her guidance counselor told her that maybe she needs to set her sights our expectations a little bit lower. But she went anyway. And she has an incredible story and she has an incredible track record. So I think that that's the point of the congressman's, what his public positions have been. He loves Judge Childs. She is very qualified. She's been nominated already to the second highest court in the land, which is the D.C. Circuit Court. We look forward to confirming her for that. So I think that this is consistent with what the congressman was pointing out, although he had a preferred candidate, but he also said that that was not the only candidate.
You know, one of the critiques, and I'll even say some friendly critiques of President Biden and his team, is that President Biden was Scranton Joe, that he was trying to reach out not only to those on the left, but basically a bigger swath of America, kind of, bridge all of that. And a perspective is that, as defined by some parts of the Build Back Better legislation, that the progressive wing of the party became the defining edge of the Biden administration. And there's worry that a lot of the president's poll numbers have slipped as he hasn't seemed to be in that pragmatic deal-making center. I know you may have a different view. I'd love to hear it. Do you sense that in this speech that he's going to give and laying out the priorities, he's going to try to swing back to deal with the Kristen Sinemas, the Joe Manchins, other pragmatists that are, perhaps more in the center than many other senators in the party right now?
Well, I just strongly disagree with the premise. Let's go back. The American Rescue Plan we passed with only Democratic votes because Republicans in the Congress would not come along. But the bill was supported by a majority of Republicans in this country. So that was a bipartisan bill. It was necessary so that we could buy vaccines, buy tests, get masks out to people, reopen schools. Only 50% of schools were open when we came in. Now 95+% of schools are open. Those were bipartisan things. And then if you push on to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was bipartisan, that bill was doing things that Republicans and Democrats have desired for decades, and that is fixing our crumbling infrastructure. But did we do it with equity in mind? Absolutely. That's why we're removing lead pipes. That's why we're expanding broadband and all of those other things. So we stand by our record. And if you look at Build Back Better, the provisions in there, child tax credit, reducing child poverty by 50% in 1 year should not be considered progressive. It shouldn't be considered Democratic or Republican. You know what it should be considered? The right thing to do. And that's why I'm with this president, because he's guided by a moral compass, and he's watched working families get the short end of the stick in this country for too long. So leveling the playing field, evening out the tax code, and importantly, reducing the financial pressures on families is also would help with the inflationary squeeze that too many families are facing. So that would be reducing childcare costs, reducing healthcare costs. All of those costs take a big housing cost. All of those take a big chunk, big bite out of families' income at the end of the month. So no, I think the president will take time to highlight those things that he has done, and the fact that he is guided by protecting and trying to help working families get a fair shake and get ahead.
Cedric, is there a pathway for the elements, the big elements of Build Back Better through regular order, which I know Senator Manchin is insisting on? Is there a pathway, or because of reconciliation, do you absolutely have to have a reconciliation process around the biggest features of Build Back? I mean, I guess the other word is, whether you call it Build Back Better or not, do you have to have the reconciliation channel to pass President Biden's agenda?
Well, I'll tell you what we need. We need willing partners to pass the legislation. This legislation is important. It's, part of what we see is obstruction just for the sake of obstruction. Obstruction just for the sake of getting a leg up in the next election. And what we're focused on is really families. And so I say this all the time, and I'm not flippant when I say it, but politicians worry about the next election. Statesmen worry about the next generation. And we wish that we can find some statesmen and stateswomen on the opposite side so that we could deal with child poverty. We could deal with education. We could deal with inflation. We can deal with all those things that Build Back Better would address. But what I'm afraid of, and I've seen too much of, is this notion that we're going to make Biden a one-term president by making sure the country suffers under his watch. That's not American, and that's not lifting and pushing families forward. So we are open. This president has entertained and brought down more people from the opposite side than probably any president in modern history, because he wants to be bipartisan and he's looking for willing partners. So the question is, if they're against everything that we're for, then what are they for? Tell us what you would do to tackle inflation, because you won't even confirm our Fed nominees whose job it is to assist with inflationary pressures. So, that's a long way to say, what do they stand for? Where are they, and will they meet us halfway? And the proof is they have yet to do that.
Another thing that I'm sure the president is going to address is Ukraine, the crisis in Europe, the solvency and strength of our relations with NATO allies and others. Ron Klain has said, of course, that'll be part of the speech. You know, there's not a domestic issue I can think of that doesn't have some element of an international component. How do you think the president is going to weave together the question of how America comes back together as a nation, both domestically and in dealing with international engagement? Because we see divides where, you know, on the Republican side, we have President Trump and some other senators, you know, calling Vladimir Putin savvy and super smart. How's the president going to respond to that in the State of the Union?
Well, I think the goal, period, is to make sure that America understands that we have a real interest in making sure that democracy is not attacked around the world or here at home, considering January 6th and other assaults on voting rights. But I think the president has shown great leadership in rallying the world and the NATO community around Ukraine and the issue of Russia's aggression. And I think that is important, that we continue to show leadership on the world stage. I think the sanctions are severe, the sanctions are real, and I think that Russia as a whole will pay dearly for the ambition and aggression of Mr. Putin. So I think that the president will, again, continue to lay out to the American people why it's important and what we're doing. And he's done that, I believe, in 2 speeches so far, or 2 addresses to the American people, and he'll touch on it again.
Look, I was critical in a recent piece I wrote in a friendly way of Senator Schumer in the sense that he had brought, somewhat miraculously, the voting rights bill to the floor of the Senate, and it was gone in half a day. You know, I sort of said, hey, you got it on the floor of the Senate. Why not leave it there for months? Why not leave it there as the business of the Senate for a very long time? Let Republicans, you know, either be constructive and join on board, or to be, you know, flamboyantly opposed, kind of, you know, to continue to make voting rights, which also is another placeholder, I think, for racial divide in this country and a lot of other questions on inequality and access. Do you think, so I guess I have 2 parts just to finish this up. Do you think it was a mistake not to leave the voting rights bill, which was so important to our democracy, on the floor of the Senate for a long time and just keep it there? And how are we approaching very toxic issues around race, inequality, geographic divides? I know it's a big question and we don't have a lot of time, but I just feel like it's incumbent of us to ask that question of how we begin to improve and bring the country back together, as opposed to be satisfied with the toxicity we have.
I'll touch the voting first. I think Senator Schumer, in his wisdom, wanted to make sure people were on the record of where they stood in this moment of time in history in terms of protecting voting rights or watching them erode. The Freedom to Vote Act had been out there in the Senate for a long time. The John Lewis Voting Rights and Advancement Act had been out there, and Senator Manchin had been working with others to see if he could get bipartisan support for voting rights bills. And you can't tie down the Senate, because we're still putting judges on the bench that will do justice and love mercy and follow the law and do all of those things. So we couldn't bog it down, but we're not going to give up on it. We're going to keep fighting for voting rights, and we're going to keep working. I think you have a group of senators right now working on voting rights legislations and election reform. But on your bigger point of how do we bring this country together, I think that this president has been very clear everywhere he speaks that America, the idea of America, is not a zero-sum game. And unfortunately, I watched presidents and governors before him push this notion that in order for you to get ahead, somebody has to fall behind, and that if someone else gets a job, you can't get that job. And that is just not true. We don't have to push someone down so that we can lift ourselves up in this country. So just because we are uplifting and helping minority communities tackle systemic racism and discrimination that they've faced since the beginning of time, it doesn't mean that we're holding non-minorities back. Everybody, when everyone does well, everyone does well. And it's not like those who are already doing well are going to suffer because we lift people up. So we're serious about racial equity. That's why the cabinet is so diverse. And that's why you have so many different backgrounds. You have someone like me who went to public schools, HBCU for college, Tulane Law School, sitting in the West Wing of the White House as an advisor to the president because he values diversity, and it doesn't mean that other people can't be here. So we are trying to bring this country together by actually talking about it and reminding people that we will all do better when we lift everyone up. And that is rebuild the middle class from the bottom up and the middle out. And I am, proud that we're actually attempting to do that.
Let me squeeze one last one in because you're good friends with Mitch Landrieu, and Mitch Landrieu is as I understand, the infrastructure czar. When are we going to begin to really feel those dollars begin to pump into major infrastructure projects? We saw, the collapse of this bridge up in Pittsburgh, but as you look at it, you and Mayor Landrieu are going to be with the president out there reminding people how important it is to invest in. We don't spend enough time on this topic, in my view, but just any thoughts on that?
No, that money is flowing. I think that Mitch gave an update just a couple of days ago on how many hundreds of millions of dollars have already started to flow to real projects. And look, one of the things that we believe in this White House is that this was not a stimulus package. This is not just going out looking for shovel-ready projects. This is really looking for shovel-worthy projects because we don't get a chance to invest in our infrastructure that often. And because it's historic, we want to make sure we're going to get the biggest returns on our investment that we're making into America's infrastructure, that we're improving Americans' day-to-day life, roads, bridges, congestion, even the safety aspect of it also. So Mitch is doing an incredible job. He's getting it out. And I believe that, you'll see and people will feel that money in their communities.
Well, Cedric Richmond, Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement and Senior Advisor to President Biden, we very much are grateful for your candor and spending this time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and enjoy your weekend.
Inflation is at a 40-year high, and with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, gas and food are likely to become even more expensive for Americans. These issues are framing how Republican lawmakers are viewing President Biden's first year in office. Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota is my next guest and a member of several important committees, including Banking, Budget, Veterans Affairs, Armed Services. And I spoke with Senator Cramer before Russia invaded Ukraine. Take a listen.
Senator Cramer, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been looking forward to talking to you. This is our annual time we like to take a snapshot of America's report card. We've got President Biden is going to come, give a State of the Union address, but I kind of like to do the real State of the Union, have, alternative views that sort of look at what's going well, what's not going well. And right now, the headline for me is the price of, peanut butter and steak and basic food, and inflation has gone crazy, and a lot of folks didn't see it coming. I'd love to get, an understanding of how you're looking at the economy right now and whether or not you share my concerns about regular folks and what they're buying.
Well, for sure, I care about regular folks and what they're buying. One of the things, though, I think for full disclosure, that's somewhat unique coming from North Dakota is we produce two of the most important things that the world needs. And one of them is food, and the other one, of course, is fuel. So being the number 2 producer of oil, number 1 producer of wheat, and about 10 or 11 other crops, and, a whole bunch of food for a hungry world. In other words, we're a commodity-based economy. So
right.
if you're in one of those industries that produces the economy, inflation works pretty well for you. If you're getting $16 a bushel for your soybeans, you don't like the cost of diesel, to plant them and to harvest them, but you do like the price at the elevator. If you're an oil producer or work out in the Bakken as part of the value chain for the oil and gas industry, $95
right.
Barrel oil does pretty well for you. All of that said, everybody's a consumer, and the inflation issue is the issue. There's no question. The economy is almost always one of the top 2 or 3 issues, at least people's individual economies. As long as things are going well, they don't worry a lot about the economy. But when things are going poorly, like they are now, and inflation, of course, being the biggest problem, it's on everybody's mind. I hear it the most from people back home, even in our very rich commodity cycle there in North Dakota.
Well, Senator, I know that inflation is, one of these things they said was transitory, going to go away, pretty quickly. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. But one thing that has been with us, and I just want to be candid and upfront, I think President Trump contributed a lot to it, is the national debt is driving higher and higher and higher. And I think there are senators like Senator Manchin that have been expressing concerns about the debt. But the GOP used to be the guardian of concern about the debt. How are things on that front?
Yeah, so really up until the pandemic, even though spending was up, the economy was growing at a pace as well, or maybe better in terms of the economy. I mean, productivity of the economy, gross domestic product. And really ever since the Budget Act a number of years ago, the discretionary side of the ledger has been pretty steady or even just a little bit lower. That all got blown up in the pandemic. I mean, we were flying airplanes while we were building them. Nobody was arguing with the appropriations that we were putting out just to help keep the economy afloat. Of course, the Fed behavior, monetizing everything they can, providing more capital, adding to their balance sheet. Everybody just sort of accepted that for about a year. Without, they always knowing that at some point we're going to have to deal with the debt that comes with that. But in the short time, this was the risk we had to take. However, as we were coming out, even after the election, we're coming out of the pandemic, heading into 2021. It just seems that Democrats with their 50-50 Senate majority and their slight majority in the House and the presidency could not resist adding fuel to the fire of the economy. And they were warned by many people that another $2 trillion, as they put into the American Rescue Plan, this was not the time to do it. It was going to be bad. They insisted on doing it, and it was bad. And so because of that, what I believe was a major political error on their, on their part, they tend to own inflation. Now, you tend to own it anyway when you're in charge of everything, even if there's some blame by the previous administration and previous Republican Congress. There's just no question that was an error that gave them the mantle for inflation. And then the Fed has also been equally slow. You use the word transitory. That was a term that I think Jay Powell regrets ever using, and he wanted to pivot away from it, as you know, recently. And he's, of course, up for reconfirmation as chairman for a second term of the Federal Reserve. I talk to him pretty regularly. And if they would have started easing easing and even just slight interest rates earlier, slower, it would have been a much less painful recovery for interest rates. Unfortunately, or for inflation, unfortunately, they did not do that. Like any problem that you delay, the fix becomes more dramatic. So there are a lot of things that could have been avoided and that they were warned about by a number of people that they didn't heed. And now they don't. And on top of that, on the supply side of things, well, when you stop the development of important geopolitical infrastructure like the XL pipeline and make yourself more reliant on other people's oil, and then you stop drilling or stop permitting on federal lands, just a lot of unforced errors that they made that have contributed, and as a result, they really do own. They, being the Democratic brand, really does own this inflation.
Well, I mean, you raise a really interesting and important moment at what may be a real key geopolitical inflection point. We don't know at the time of our talking right now what's going to happen with Russia, what's going to happen with Nord Stream 2. We do know that the Germans gave up a lot of nuclear power plants, so they're a lot more energy dependent they are now. And one of America's sources of power in the world has been, and the reason we are so engaged in the world, a lot of it has to do with the flow of energy. To allies and ourselves, the peaceful flow of trade, of energy. And we achieved energy independence in this country. At least I think we've still got it, maybe thanks to North Dakota and Fargo and everything going on there. But it raises this really interesting question of how we responsibly, and I would hope a bipartisan way, look at the balance of equities of, being environmentally sound and smart about the future, but also not forfeiting energy assets. And I just love to ask you, is that something you think deeply about?
Well, it is, Steve. And here's the thing. Herein lies what I believe could be Joe Biden's greatest opportunity. You know, they talk about BBB, it's gone, it's blown up, it's never coming back. You know, but they also talk about, what about a climate package? What about the climate part of BBB? Is there something to be done there? To which I say, as long as you start with a white sheet of paper and Joe Manchin at the helm, I think we can have a bipartisan geopolitical discussion about increments that take advantage of American-made energy and American-made innovation, working in partnership with our European allies in a trade way that further, well, that dilutes Vladimir Putin's captivity of the rest of Europe in terms of an energy market, and recognizes that American-made energy, even whether it's fossil energy, nuclear energy, to your point about Germany, or for that matter, other renewable energies that aren't so dependent on China's value chain and supply chain. I think together we can agree on some things. You might have seen just before Christmas, General H.R. McMaster and I wrote an op-ed that's talked about a geopolitical solution that where the United States and Europe could come together and sort of co-op along with sort of along the lines of their their carbon club. They have a border adjustment. I think that a tariff of some sort that sets a standard that the United States and Europe meets, that Russia and China do not meet, addresses the climate issue and the greenhouse gas emissions issue at a global level where it should be addressed with American and European solutions. I just think it's one of those target-rich areas where there can actually be buy-in on a bipartisan basis. And I'd say sometimes it's dangerous for me even just to talk about it, but I like talking about it because
it does raise this interesting question of whether there are deals that are possible that include, hydrogen, that include gas, include fossils, but include wind, include other elements of that package. One of the things that I've learned, frankly, Senator, which in the nuclear area, is we're like experimenting with Bill Gates's new, nuclear facility ideas, smaller nuclear reactors, et cetera. The fuel from that doesn't come from the United States. Guess where it comes from? Russia. Right. And while we're criticizing the Germans on Nord Stream 2, we're dependent on Russian nuclear fuel. Right. It's like kind of, let's make headlines with that, folks. You can tweet it out. It's a big question mark we should be looking at. But let me just go, one step further. So, I think that you just said something really important, which is there's an opportunity for bipartisan climate work attached to, diverse energy solutions. It could, if you look at GE, for instance, GE has nuclear, GE has hydrogen, GE has wind too. And so that kind of packaging is something that a guy from North Dakota could possibly support.
I could sure get on board with discussing it. In fact, GE has a very large wind turbine blade factory in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And North Dakota also has a lot of wind. When I was an energy regulator, I cited a lot of it, and a lot more of it's been built since then. There's no question in all of the energy area, the one of the big challenge we have, solar, 75% of the supply chain for solar comes from China. And we just have to cut off China. I mean, that sounds dramatic, but we should not be so dependent. We can bring a lot of that supply chain home. Now, we have to agree, as Republicans and Democrats on some things, including the mining of the critical minerals, everything from uranium to lithium for batteries, and all of that exists in the United States. We actually have so much higher environmental standards as well as far as workplace and labor standards. We really can do better. It'll be a little more expensive, perhaps, but I think in the long run, it's the right thing for the climate. It's the right thing for our economy. It's the right thing for global and national security. And this is what I mean by, I think we need to start talking with our geopolitical allies on some sort of a trade basis, a geopolitical solution that recognizes how much better we can be doing some of the things that we've acquiesced over time. I mean, there's no reason in the world why we have to get uranium from Russia. I mean, we invented this thing, but over the years, we've let that slip away. We can bring a lot of that back. And by the way, Steve, that also means that the manufacturing process for a whole bunch of other things, the supply chain for a whole bunch of other things can be brought back into, and I don't want to hog it all. Obviously, we don't have the workforce for all of that, but it should be at least brought into the family of freedom-loving countries. And then through that process, we can do the things that otherwise require some sort of arms race. I'd rather have an innovation race.
Let me ask you finally, and I, would address this to leading Republicans and leading Democrats and the president himself. I interviewed George Will earlier today, and George made the comment. He said, we're living in a very weird time where free enterprise, trade, belief in innovation and capitalism and the moral benefits of capitalism, which have raised just hundreds of millions of people from poverty. 42% in 1981 of the people in the world were living in extreme poverty. Today it's 10%. He said there are very few defenders of these principles within the Republican Party today. That's before you begin looking at who might pop up in the Democratic side. But I would ask, what should our North Star be? And not in a partisan way, but it just sort of looks like some of the principles we had that kind of move the nation forward have been derailed because of concerns about inequality, because of one side being unfair to the other. I'd just love to get your insights as a person who cares about these issues, what we might do to, steady the ship.
Yeah, so George Will is right on point, I think, and I know you can't steady the ship. You certainly can't turn the ship around until you steady it, and so it's always going to be an incremental approach, I suppose. But first thing we have to do is recognize what you just said and what George Will said, and that is that what made us great in the first place was freedom, and that we've eroded that a little bit at a time over time, sometimes necessarily, whether it was the early labor movement, some regulatory things that if left to the vices sometimes of complete unhinged capitalism, we maybe wouldn't be in as good a place. But all of that said, those foundations are still what made America better and more competitive. And this is why you'll hear me always stress unleashing innovation rather than regulation. I think when it comes to just personal freedoms, in fact, even we need to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation, even within our own government. Quite honestly, we don't allow risk taking anymore. We want people to take risks, but then once a risk doesn't turn out, we want to punish the hell out of them. And we've got to kind of restore that attitude. I think that innovation really is the solution, but it's hard to do that when you're constrained by so much government, so much bureaucracy, so much risk aversion, which is the result of all of the things that you've talked about. And we have created so much bureaucracy around energy and the environment, so much bureaucracy about food processing, the manufacturing process, and labor. And what's happened is we've then acquiesce, or we really transfer a lot of productivity to places like China, who don't have any of our values.
Right.
They're not only unregulated, they're controlled. And so you have people working in sweatshops and basically slave labor. And we benefit from that in terms of buying cheap stuff. But it's really, for the other thing we need to do, quite honestly, since you brought it up, is we need to start teaching this stuff again in our institutions of education and higher learning, because, let's face it, we now have elected officials. We have United States senators who don't mind using the word socialism, even considering themselves as democratic socialists. That is a far cry from what George Will was talking about. And I'd love in our global society, and let's face it, we are dependent on each other. We are 20% of the world's economy. We're only 5% of the world's population. We're big consumers, but most of the world lives somewhere else. We need each other on a global basis. So, you can't unilaterally, disarm yourself and for example, in trade deals and all. It's complex. I don't want to oversimplify it, is my main point. But at the same time, we've lost a lot by sort of forgetting that North Star, that compass.
I'm going to squeeze in one last one here. I think if you look at honestly at both parties, the constituents in both parties, there are groups in both parties that have felt demeaned, mishandled, kind of left behind. You might look at issues of race that have driven a lot of politics. Now you might look at the issue of a lot of working class Americans that fought for this country, who felt like we fought the Cold War and China won. And you see a lot of people in this toxic time kind of broadcasting to each other. I'm just wondering how we get back to listening to each other, caring for it, realize we're on the same ship. And I know it's a big question. And you're up North Dakota. I don't know what the situation is there, but it does raise the question of how we get back to hearing one another and then trying to kind of figure it out. Is how much of that may happen among your colleagues, that kind of discussion up in the gym?
It needs to happen more often. I don't, to be honest with you, I don't worry so much about how members of Congress communicate and relate to one another. I worry more about the people we work for, because we really, at the end of the day, the politics is driven by the populace. So I think one of the things, Steve, is more members need to spend more time on talk radio back home. I do a couple of hours a week, and they need to talk to their own constituents, because from time to time, first of all, you need to listen. But then occasionally it's important for you to help persuade as well. And that takes earning political capital with your constituents, just like you do here, and then sharing some of it back. I'll give you one example. And I just did an interview on the subway coming over here. This issue of President Biden indicating right out of the chute or during the campaign that his first Supreme Court nominee needs to be a Black woman. Now, you see people in my party that are all up in arms about it, seizing that, that criteria as somehow bad in and of itself. And to which I'd say, well, if this was 100 years ago and you couldn't find a Black woman lawyer qualified to be on the Supreme Court, maybe you could have something to argue about. But the reality is, there are a whole bunch of Black women that are qualified to be on the Supreme Court. What's wrong with that being one of the criteria when there's never been one? Why wouldn't we celebrate that? That's how I feel. And I know when I talk like this, some people look at me cross-eyed, but I like to challenge.
No, it's heartening. It's heartening, actually. I mean, it's heartening to hear somebody getting out of their, comfortable groove.
I also don't think that person, whoever they are, should be given an easier road to confirmation because they are a Black woman. But I don't expect that to be the case. We ought to celebrate that, and then hold them just as accountable for all the other things that do matter, like your qualifications, your education, your judicial philosophy and demeanor. All those things matter, and then you're honoring each other in a way that. But I also think this conversation we're having right now is part of the contribution, Steve. And I think we need to do a whole lot more of that. I can be as partisan as anybody, but I think generally when I am, it's based on a real philosophy or a strong conviction that I have. Certainly not on the person's political party affiliation. But there's no question we ought to get our smile back. First of all, I've said that often. We shouldn't be so angry. Anger is not a real great quality. And if we do that, we can be a lot more productive. One of the other problems is that I think that the media, by and large, social media in particular, 24-hour cable, whether it's on the right or on the left, it has just done more to divide people and to provide lanes for comfort zones for people. And that just doesn't allow for the uncomfortable, conversations across political spectrums.
Yeah. Well, Senator Kevin Cramer, I think your video's gone out. I'm going to tell my producers to leave every word that you said in this. It's been a delight talking to you. Really fascinating. And I would love to have this conversation with you anytime. So thank you so much for joining us.
Let's do it again soon. Thank you.
The health of the U.S. economy and inflation will no doubt be among the key topics in the President's State of the Union address. And on Tuesday night, Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, joins me now to talk about the state of the economy as he sees it. Mark, great to be with you. I feel like you and I have been talking about America's report card at various times for decades. You're the guy we always go to kind of get a sense, take the temperature of what's good and what's not so good in the U.S. economy. Right now, inflation running very high. I've seen your comments and concerns about the price of oil now hitting above over $100 a barrel. And as I discussed with Cedric Richmond earlier, the president, as far as I can tell, doesn't have a lot of easy tools to just turn that down. What's your take on the seriousness of the inflation, and what are your biggest up at night worries about the U.S. economy?
Well, Steve, it's good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, we've been talking about this for at least a few decades. So it's, keep the tradition going. Obviously there's some things to be thankful for, right? I mean, 2 years after the pandemic hit, we've come a long way back. We've created a lot of jobs. The economy is creating about 500,000 jobs per month, which is a very strong pace of growth. Unemployment, which peaked out at 15% in the teeth of the pandemic 2 years ago, is now down to 4%. And at this pace of job growth will continue to decline. So, that's a key achievement, getting the economy, back here in terms of jobs, in terms of overall economic output. But of course, having said that, we have a lot of challenges, in many cases related to the pandemic, and that's high inflation. Obviously, this is very financially painful for many households, particularly low middle income households. In my view, it's largely related to the disruptions created by the pandemic, supply chain disruptions. A lot of people have gotten sick or taking care of sick people or fearful of getting sick, and therefore haven't been able to go to work. And as the pandemic fades, and hopefully, Steve, that is the case, that we'll likely suffer new waves of the virus, but each new wave will be less disruptive than the previous one. Like Omicron was less disruptive than Delta, which was less disruptive than Alpha. Then the supply chains will start to iron themselves out. People will get back to filling these open positions, and the inflation will moderate. Unfortunately, Russia-Ukraine complicates things, because the key link from what's going on there to our economy is oil prices, gasoline prices, and they're obviously going to go higher here. And so it's going to make the inflation problem even more severe in the near term. But, hopefully the pandemic fades, we get to the other side of the Russian-Ukrainian situation, and inflation starts to moderate. We won't get back to something we feel comfortable with next month, next quarter, but a year from now, 18 months from now, I think we'll be in a better place. But there's a lot of forecasting there, a lot of risk, obviously.
Mark, I went to an Apple store the other day in Fairfax and tried to buy a little electric cord adapter between two different gadgets. They didn't have any. They said, supply chain hits us too. So I want to ask you about supply chain. I interviewed Jason Furman, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the other day, and he says one of the drivers of the supply chain problem is not just people not at work, not whatever. It's that people had gobs of cash. We had a lot of people given money by the government. We had a lot of pent-up demand because of COVID when people weren't out buying, and then all the switches got turned on at a certain point. So we have enormous demand. So it's not just that the ports and rails aren't running as much as they used to. It's just the demand is higher. And I asked him, does he think the Trump administration and the Biden administration overstimulated the economy, put too much money? And he says that's part of the story. I'd love to get your take on whether Jason Furman is a bit right on that.
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think demand was strong. I mean, because of the pandemic, we sheltered in place. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't travel. We couldn't go to ball games. So we shifted our spending to stuff, everything from consumer electronics, the cord you're trying to get, to furniture, to, I've been on my back deck for a couple of years. I've invested in deck chairs. I've got 2 power washers. My wife asked, well, why 2? I can't really answer the question, but, bought a lot of stuff. But the supply chains were having no trouble delivering those goods, those products to us back in the summer of 2021, after the last of the stimulus hit the economy, the American Rescue Plan. No problem at all. There were no shortages of any consequence. The prices were not an issue. We weren't even debating about it. The inflation did pick up, but that was more a feature rather than a bug, right? Because if you remember back a year ago, the concern was inflation had been too low for too long coming out of the financial crisis. So it wasn't really an issue. But it was with Delta, when Delta hit back in the summer, fall of last year, which, by the way, Steve, that not only hit us hard, but it hit Asia particularly hard. They were very lightly vaccinated at the time. And of course, China had its no COVID policy. And that's when the problems really began. So, that's when chip plants shut down, and you couldn't get the semiconductors you needed to build cars or computers or iPhones or whatever it may be. So, no, I don't think it was about demand. The supply chains were very able to meet the demand that was there. It's when the supply chains were shut down because of the Delta variant when this became a problem.
Mark, another area you and I have talked about in the past is the international dimensions of our economic performance. And before Russia had invaded Ukraine, now in Kiev, and that havoc, if you talk to Democratic or Republican House members and ask them, what's the thing that pops up now more than anything else that you're surprised by? And, most of them would say, the thing that comes up a lot, that people are worried about China. They're worried about competing with China. They're worried about, is China playing by the rules? They're worried about what China is doing in the world. And I think this I wouldn't say strategy, but this posture that somehow decoupling from China is actually possible when someone like me worries and said we're so joined at the hip that decoupling means like global depression in my book. Tell me how you look at China. How does Moody's look at an issue down the road and looks at political intervention when economic integration has been such a part of the last two decades with China and the United States?
Well, I agree with you, Steve. I think we are tethered at the hip. And I do think, in general, globalization has served our economy well. I mean, it's created winners, big winners, and some losers. So, not everyone has done well as a result of globalization. And of course, when I say globalization, kind of leading the way here was China's entry into the global economy back beginning in 2001 when they entered into the World Trade Organization. So broadly speaking, and for the economy as a whole, globalization has been a very significant positive for our growth, for jobs, for our living standards. Having said that, I think the strategy had been for a couple of decades after the entry into the WTO, that if we embraced China closely enough, that they would ultimately play by the rules and engage in a fair way. And I think that has not happened, at least not I think to the expectation of policymakers, appropriately so. And I think we need to put pressure on China to engage China to change those practices that just aren't consistent with the entry into the World Trade Organization. Everything around intellectual property rights, open access to their markets, cybersecurity, all those things I think are very, very important. And I think that's, that engagement began in earnest under the, back in the Obama administration. It continued on in the Trump administration. Of course, the Biden administration seems to be following a very similar kind of policy approach. So far, we haven't seen a lot of results there yet, but I think we ultimately will. So I think that's the right kind of policy to pursue here, and it's appropriate. I think it is appropriate to engage China to make sure that they do follow the rules appropriately.
Another thing that I'm reminded of, I saw investor John Paulson the other day, and I was reminded of that Michael Lewis book, The Long Short. Some people did see the subprime crisis coming, even though then Secretary of Treasury Tim Geithner says, how would anybody see that coming? So I guess my question to you is not to reflect back on that, but to ask you as we look forward, do you worry that there are any bubbles in the U.S. economy that ought to be on policymakers' dashboard? Soft points or points where we could have a repeat of the kind of crises we've seen in the past, which we seem to have every 10 to 15 years?
Not in the financial system, Steve. I think, coming out of the financial crisis, there was a lot of reform. We had the Dodd-Frank reform, and there was a lot of other changes in regulation and rules that, has resulted in a much better capitalized financial system, meaning that the banks and other large institutions have a cash cushion so that if anything does go wrong, they would be able to manage through it, digest it without requiring any kind of government or taxpayer support. And also the rules have resulted in much better underwriting, meaning the credit, the lending that's being done is, I think, being done well and more appropriately. And I'm less concerned that, we're making loans that are to people or to businesses that ultimately won't be in a situation to repay those loans. But if you pressed me and you said, hey, Mark, where should we be looking just in case, if things continue to go forward here, where would I look? I'd highlight two things. One is the very strong house price growth we've experienced in recent years, particularly over the past year. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but house prices have just gone skyward. In fact, I was just looking at some data. 1/4 of all of the nation's 400 plus metropolitan statistical areas experienced over 20% house price growth last year. That's pretty heady house price growth. And that's okay, and that can work when interest rates are low, but that doesn't work so well when interest rates are high and rising. And so you can already feel it, kind of the housing market starting to struggle with these higher rates because they're conflating with the higher house prices, and affordability is becoming a real problem, and people can't buy these homes. First-time home buyer share of sales is declining. So I think that's an area where I think we need to focus and just ensure that when house price growth slows and if we see house price declines in certain markets, that we're prepared for that. The other area I just call out, and I won't go into any detail unless you're interested, is in corporate lending. You've got two kinds of, broadly speaking, businesses out there. One group that's, great balance sheet, lots of cash. They're borrowing. It's only because it's close to free money. But then you have another group of businesses that have, levered up pretty significantly. A lot of it's financial engineering and private equity firms coming in and kind of leveraging up those companies, which, works okay when the economy's fine and sales are strong and interest rates are low, but that may not work out so well if interest rates rise and the economy struggles. So if I had to pinpoint two things that I'd say, let's shine a brighter light on this and take a closer look, it would be those two things.
Well, Mark Zandi, Chief Economist at Moody's Analytics. I feel like I could talk to you for hours and it would seem like minutes. Fascinating as always. Thank you so much for joining us in our America's Report Card show today. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Take care.
My next guest was a member of the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board. How is the president led on this issue and what more needs to be done? Joining me now is Dr. Celine Gounder, infectious disease specialist and epidemiologist at NYU and Bellevue Hospital. Dr. Gounder, great to see you. Look, we're trying to take stock of everything. We're doing snapshots. What's the temperature of America's health today?
I think we are approaching the end of this Omicron surge. In some parts of the country, like New York City, for example, where I am, we are back to where we were prior to the Omicron surge, where we were back in September, October. There's still a little ways to go to get back down to the low of June of last summer, but we are making progress in that respect. There is this new subvariant BA.2, which is also a form of Omicron that has been spreading really around the world, not just in the US, that is overtaking the original Omicron. And it doesn't really seem to be causing a new surge. It seems to simply be prolonging this tail of the Omicron surge. I think, unfortunately, where are we headed now? I think a lot of Americans, and I understand this as somebody who has been in the front lines of hospitals, on the front lines of the policy public health response, as well as in the media. I think we're all exhausted. We want to move on. I understand that. The challenge is that we are in danger of repeating the same mistakes that have been made with every epidemic before COVID, which is that we get exhausted, we become short-sighted, we don't build the necessary pandemic preparedness to protect ourselves and insulate and shield ourselves better for next time. And there will be a next time, whether it's another surge driven by a new variant, and there will be more variants, or whether it's another emerging infectious disease. We really do need to do a much better job of preparing for that future. With respect to future variants, some of the modeling done by computational biologists and virologists would indicate that depending on whether you have a game-changing variant or slower mutation, you're looking at probably the emergence of something that is truly game-changing like Delta or Omicron whether it's somewhere between every 2 to 10 years. So there's a very wide range there. And it's hard to predict more precisely right now than that. We also anticipate there will be slower mutation of the virus. What will this mean for vaccination needing to revaccinate? That remains unclear. Right now, I think the strategy has shifted a little bit from boosting with updating the vaccines for new variants, and rather developing a what we call pan-sarbecovirus or pan-coronavirus universal coronavirus vaccine that would protect you not just against all the SARS-CoV-2 variants, but also the original SARS and other coronaviruses. So I think there's going to be a shift in strategy to protect us from the new variants. Vaccine technologies will be a piece of that, but we have much broader preparedness that we need to be putting our funding and our attention into. And I just fear that people are going to commit the same mistakes as before and really just move on without taking those steps to build up our public health systems.
Right. Dr. Gounder, I was very excited to talk to you about this because I wonder, even in the way we frame questions, even today, we're looking at America's report card, but in the segments, I keep trying to raise the international dimension of our performance, our connectivity. I've interviewed people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Eric Topol, Dr. Richard Hatchett, who's head of the I think it's called the Commission for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And one of the things that haunts me in this topic is our lack of coverage and seeming concern at some level for where the virus is elsewhere in the world. And that if there are hotspots and if there are variants that are growing in human beings like us and they can come in, we're somehow talking at this as if we're detached from that. And I just wonder, what is the state of health? What's our report card in making sure that we're not blindly vulnerable to whatever variant it may be stewing up somewhere else? And is that the right way to frame it? Because I just don't hear that discussion as much as I'd like in the United States.
Yeah, I think we tend to be fairly, frankly, provincial in how we think about things here. But if you look at every single variant to date, those have emerged elsewhere around the world where there's been high levels of transmission and low levels of vaccination. And so whether that's was in the UK with the Alpha variant, in Brazil with the Gamma variant, Beta, and Omicron, well, Omicron probably not, but Beta in South Africa. Omicron was detected in South Africa, but probably originated elsewhere. I think we need to be paying attention to what is happening in other places, and that means helping build up surveillance. This is one area South Africa has frankly really excelled and outperformed countries like our own with genomic surveillance. So helping partners, other countries build up that surveillance. And then secondly, making sure that populations are getting vaccinated, not just our own, but also those overseas, because vaccination, while it does not stop all transmission, it does reduce transmission. It reduces viral replication in people who are infected. They don't have the virus replicating for as long. So you do reduce the risk of the emergence of a new variant. And another key piece of this, too, is to really look at immunocompromised populations. We know that chronic infections in immunocompromised people have been the source of variants. And what can we be doing not only to vaccinate them, but to address the underlying immunocompromise? And in many parts of the world, that means making sure people are tested and treated for HIV. And I think that is another piece of this that we have put on the back burner. We know that management of infectious diseases like HIV or TB or malaria have been compromised by the COVID pandemic. And so I think it's really important that we redouble our efforts on that front as well, that we go back to the successes of the PEPFAR programs, which is the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, started under President George W. Bush, which has been very successful, but really making sure we continue to build on those successes to get people who have HIV diagnosed and treated so that we don't have that huge gap, that huge vulnerability in whom you could have new variants emerge as well.
One of the things that has happened recently is the CDC easing masking requirements in a lot of places, in a lot of the country. How do you feel about that?
The CDC is going to be making some announcements later today, providing more guidance on that. the preview I've gotten is that the metrics that will be used will be more logical for where we are in the pandemic today. Certain metrics like test positivity don't make a lot of sense today. A lot of people are using home rapid tests, so those numbers don't figure into the official testing numbers. So it's really hard to interpret those test positivity numbers. So the focus moving forward will really be on cases, number of cases, how quickly they may be increasing in an area, hospitalizations, but also importantly, hospital capacity, because a big surge in a place like Boston or New York City or San Francisco, which has lots of hospital beds, is very different from a big surge in a rural part of the country where you may have one hospital serving hundreds of square miles, and it might be a couple hours away to your nearest hospital. So there does need to be some tailoring by where you are in the country and whether they can handle a surge. So I do think you're going to see those guidelines announced later today. And I do think those are grounded in metrics that are appropriate for where we are today.
You know, I've got the House Majority Whip, Jim Clyburn, waiting, so I'm not going to keep him waiting long. He's a great guy, and I just do not want him to run away. But I just want to ask you, briefly, as a member of the Biden transition team, perhaps this is an unfair question. As you look at the Biden team and as you look at things, whether it's masks and test kits that have gone out, but also what you said at the beginning, which I was very sensitive to, that we're continuing, I think you said this, not making the kinds of public health infrastructure investments we have to make, not using this crisis to prepare for the next. How would you grade the team that you've been giving advice to?
I think they have been, up until really the Omicron surge, they were really focused on vaccination. And I think vaccinations are very important. But when you have a third of the population that remains unvaccinated, that a significant proportion of whom may not get vaccinated, refuse to get vaccinated, you really do have to layer other measures because there will be more, as I said, surges, variants, and we need to protect our hospitals so that the healthcare system continues to function. And we need to continue or do a better job of protecting the most vulnerable who unfortunately have borne the largest brunt of this and will continue to do so.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Celine Gounder, an infectious disease specialist and epidemiologist at NYU and Bellevue Hospital, and of course an editor-at-large and senior fellow for Kaiser Health News. I like all, and the Kaiser Family Foundation. I have a soft spot for any editor-at-larges, so really great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
President Biden's speech comes as his approval rating is hovering just above 40%, and Republicans are forecast to be in a good position to retake the House of Representatives in the midterm elections this fall. I'll say that statement is considered controversial in some corners, and I kind of want to keep the aperture open. We'll see what happens. My final guest is the third-ranking Democrat on Capitol Hill. He's a great friend of the Hill. He's someone who's had the president's ear. Welcome, Congressman Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, the House Majority Whip. Always great to be with you, sir. We have a Supreme Court nominee, and we know who it will be. I know that you and Senator Lindsey Graham had also talked about another highly qualified nominee. How do you feel about the president's choice, and what do you think this can do by way of being a constructive contribution to America's legal system and how America sees itself?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Not only do I see this as constructive for our legal system, we've been in existence for 2.5 generations. If you subtract 1776 from 2022, you get an incredible number of years. And never before now has there ever been an African-American woman seriously discussed for the United States Supreme Court. 2 years ago this day, President Biden, then candidate Biden, stood on the stage here in South Carolina and said, if given the opportunity, he would nominate an African-American woman to serve on the Supreme Court. He has kept that promise, and that's what is happening today. In that 2-year interim, a lot of names came forward. A lot of people were pushing names out there. So I decided to get in on the act and put a name forward. And I put the name of J. Michelle Childs, an outstanding judge here in South Carolina. She was one of the final 3 who were interviewed by the president. And the president decided on one. She is outstanding. She will make a great member of the Supreme Court. I applaud the president for keeping that promise, and I will support this nomination as well as this jurist that I expect to be in place very soon.
Well, I'm sure President Biden is going to speak a lot about her and share with the country what he thinks about her qualifications in his State of the Union address next week. Another subject he's going to talk about in the State of the Union is what's unfolding right now, this disaster around Ukraine, the horror around Ukraine. And I think it raises an interesting question that I've tried to been thinking a lot about. You and I have talked about this before, the toxicity in America, the attack on January 6th of the U.S. Capitol, the toxicity of American politics right now doesn't exactly translate into the rest of the world as an America that is strong and compelling and is the same force it used to be in global affairs. Do you think Vladimir Putin is watching this stuff in the United States and moving now because he sees President Trump calling him savvy and smart and other Republicans divided? I'm just interested in what the foreign policy and national security consequences are of America toxicity at this moment.
Well, I'm so glad that you frame it that way, because I think it's high time for the Americans to take a hard look at our country, where we are and how we fit into the rest of the world. And when you see Russia, you see an arch opponent. I don't like to use the word enemy, but an opponent of capitalism, an opponent of democracy, someone who's installed himself as president now for over 20 years, and see us buying into his rhetoric. And the people who are doing it are not doing a good service to this country. There is a reason that the founders put into our oath to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. There are some domestic enemies of democracy, of capitalism, who would love to see an autocracy put in place. That's why you're hearing these endearing phrases and words coming from people like the 45th president of the United States and a lot of talking heads. That is dangerous stuff. And if the American people want to pass on to their children and grandchildren a free country full of opportunity for everybody, we had better come on board and stop this thrust toward an autocracy which is taking place with the aid and comfort of a lot of elected officials who are enemies of fair, unfettered elections.
Congressman, what is the mood of your constituents when you're out talking to them? Do they still feel that being engaged in the world, both economically and even militarily, that America's presence in the world is good for them? Or do they think it's become a cost to them, that America fought the Cold War and China won, is a line I hear a lot. How do when you talk to your folks, what do they feel?
There is a common thread running among all of my constituents. I can go into a restaurant. I did on the day before yesterday, one of the so-called high side restaurants. I can go to a funeral service, as I went to on yesterday, or on the golf course where I was several days ago, and people are saying the same. They are fearful of where the country is, and they want to see less acrimonious activity taking place. They want to see this country come together. And I have yet to see anybody who say that they support legislation being passed in state after state authorizing the nullification of elections that's been votes cast by Americans. This is crazy stuff, and people are afraid of it. You go up and down the social ladder, and I hear the same from everybody.
One of the other topics we've unfortunately talked about in this past year is the racial divide in America. And I'd just love to get a sense from you. We've just seen 3 murderers of Ahmaud Arbery found guilty of federal hate crimes. But we have continued to see, maybe not all at the visibility of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others, but we've continued to see incidents in communities around the nation where unarmed people of color were killed. And I'm just wondering, in your gut, have we accomplished what we needed to do to begin substantially changing how we police, how we look at our communities and bring them together? I just want to know where you think we are. Have we made progress in the last year, or are we still sort of at the starting point?
Yes, we've made significant progress. And if you look at where we are today based upon where we were, say, Emmett Till. I was around for Emmett Till. We were around the same age when that happened to him. And so I knew what it was like. I knew what it was like to see Jimmy Jackson, people shot down in cold blood. I remember John Lewis being beaten almost to a pulp. His first beating was right here in South Carolina in the little town of Rock Hill. And nobody was held to account for any of it. Those 4 little girls, how long did it take them down in Birmingham to get an accounting for their murder? So yes, we are seeing now in almost real time, people being held to account. That's progress. But all that where we need to be, oh no, we're not there yet. All you got to look at Ahmaud Arbery's trial and see that the Justice Department was a bit reticent to go forward with that trial until the family rejected the plea deal. These are the things that people are looking at and saying, are we there yet? No, we aren't. But hopefully we'll continue our pursuit of a more perfect union. We'll never be perfect, but we should always be moving toward that perfection.
Are you satisfied, sir, with the progress of Attorney General Merrick Garland on those perpetrators around the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol?
Well, no, I'm not. I cannot say that I am. I wrote a letter 2 weeks ago calling upon the Attorney General, along with some other members of the Congress, to really either move fast or being a little more transparent. We aren't asking anybody to give up the process, but we're asking to see where there can be some transparency. And the reason we're doing that is, as you said earlier, I talk to my constituents, and when they tell me that they are holding the process in suspicion, you can't be too secretive about the process. It's almost like saying, just trust me. It's going to be all right. Well, I grew up here in South Carolina when trust did not translate into being all right.
You know, you have been such a forceful advocate for voting rights. We know that the voting rights bill that miraculously got to the U.S. Senate floor and was being debated was there for a nanosecond, like 12 hours actually. And I asked in an article I wrote, why didn't Senator Schumer leave it on the floor? You can't stop debating something by majority vote. You actually need 60 votes to stop discussing. Why not leave it on the floor for months? You know, leave it as the front. Do you think that those people who care about that voting rights legislation, which of course included the John Lewis Voting Rights Act as part of what it did, that your colleagues in the Senate and also the White House made the right decision to make that piece of legislation come and go so quickly?
Well, I don't know about that, but I know this. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about what we did not do and what did not get done. Here's what I want to talk about. They tell me that the electoral reform has bipartisan support. That is for presidential elections. I want to see them put that bill on the floor and attach to it pre-clearance provisions that's in the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And everybody ought to be able to subject their changes to the Justice Department or to some court to determine whether or not what you're doing is going to have some adverse or discriminatory impact on any group of people. So I want to see us this coming week go onto the floor with things that we can agree on. And that is, and let me just say once again, stop hiding behind this whole notion that people of color are against voter ID. We have never been against voter ID. We always ID ourselves when we go vote. Every time I go vote, I pull out my voter registration card and present it as the person who is registered there to vote. That's an ID. What we have been against is you telling me that a student ID is not a good ID, but a hunting license is a good ID. That's the kind of stuff that we're against. So let's stop the foolishness and look at what we need to do to ensure that elections can be fair, unfettered, and be able to be insulated from nullification.
Whip Clyburn, it's always great to talk to you. I just have to ask you in closing, I'm going to be up at the hall, doing my job, working up the night the State of the Union is there. I'm going to wave and see you there, hopefully. But I'm interested in, Joe Biden, whom I've had the privilege of knowing for a long time, his style is conversational. He wants to have a conversation, I imagine, with the country. But his numbers are not great right now. And I'm just wondering if you were giving him advice, which I know you do, about how to have that conversation, begin to bring people back to have confidence in what he's doing, what would be the elements most important to you?
Be conversational in every category and let the people know what each category will mean to them, their families, and their communities. It can be housing, healthcare, education, whatever it is. Let the people know this is what my proposals will do for you. This is what they will do for your families. And this is what it will do for your communities. And then I believe his numbers will begin to improve.
Well, House Majority Whip James Clyburn, always a pleasure to be with you, spend time. I always learn from it. Thanks for never turning us down, at least not yet. I imagine there'll be a time someday, but I really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to all of you and our attendees, and a big thank you to those who joined us to have these conversations. For any of you who missed this program today, we're going to have the video from the event up on our website shortly. We've got a lot of Twitter traffic around it too. Take a look at that. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.